following is a podcast with Dr. Konstantin Momot. Konstantin is a researcher and senior lecturer at QUT, the Queensland University of Technology, who specialises in magnetic resonance spectroscopy and imaging, molecular transport and diffusion, and numerical solutions for molecular dynamics. This podcast aims to promote research coming out of Australian universities and to shine light on the brilliant minds behind the work.
Hello, my name is Jasper Giroli. I'm a fourth year student at QUT, Queensland University of Technology. I'm studying electrical engineering and physics. I'm joined here today with Dr. Konstantin Momot, who is a senior lecturer at QUT. Konstantin I met earlier this year when I was studying quantum mechanics, where Konstantin, you gave a series of lectures, one of which on quantum tunneling, the harmonic oscillator and quantum, angular momentum, the whole range of lectures, and the hydrogen atom and spin. So first of all, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So to start off, do you mind sharing with me your journey into physics? Was it a smooth path, or did it take you a while to figure out your aspirations?
All right. Well, it's a good question. Well, okay, nothing's smooth in life in general. Well, I've actually got a secret because my undergraduate training was in chemistry.
Ooh.
My journey into physics was a little bit convoluted. So my undergraduate degree was in chemistry. My PhD was in physical chemistry, molecular physical chemistry. And from there, I kind of gradually migrated into physics.
Oh, nice. So what university did you get your undergraduate degree from?
I did my undergrad in Russia, in the city of Novosibirsk, which is the biggest city between Moscow and Vladivostok. So if you go on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow to Vladivostok, then Novosibirsk is almost exactly in the middle of that journey. And it's the biggest city in the eastern part of Russia. And it has a very nice university, Novosibirsk State University. So that's where I did my undergrad for 5 years. It was a 5-year degree back then.
Whoa. So you got your undergraduate degree in chemistry. Did you get your PhD from the same university?
No, no. I actually went. So I finished my undergrad in Russia, and I went to the US to do a PhD.
Oh.
And so I changed not just universities, but I changed countries. But it was still chemistry at that stage. So I still did my PhD within the Department of Chemistry at the University of Arizona.
Nice. You mentioned the degree was 5 years. So do you know how much has the teaching methodology, I guess, changed since you did your undergrad to now as you lecture?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, yes, it certainly changed a lot. But then on another level, fundamentally, the teaching of physics is still the same. So fundamentally, there's only one way to learn it, and that's do a lot of practical problem solving, lots and lots and lots of it, until you finally understand all the fine details of what you're doing. I mean, superficially, a lot of approaches to teaching have changed because, for example, we didn't have things like problem-based learning, or at least it wasn't called problem-based learning.
Yeah.
We didn't have things like flipped classroom.
Yeah.
And of course, what has really changed a lot is the technology that supports the teaching. Because back in the days of my undergrad, we didn't have video cameras in classrooms, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have internet. Because internet really emerged in the 1990s when I was already doing my PhD.
Well, these days, no one even really goes to class. Half the people stay at home and Zoom in and pretty empty
That's right.
classrooms.
That's right. So in my days, of course, if you wanted to go to lecture, then you had to get up at 7 in the morning, walk over to the uni, and sit through that lecture that sometimes would start at 8 in the morning.
Yeah.
And you had lectures going on all day.
Yeah.
Physically used to sit in all the classes.
Yeah. So moving on, your most recent paper was on portable NMR. NMR is nuclear magnetic resonance, for those that don't know, for breast density quantification in vivo, and it presented some pretty intriguing ideas. Do you mind telling us what the key takeaways from this paper were?
Well, I guess there's the short-term takeaway and there's a long-term takeaway. The long-term takeaway, I think, is really exciting, and that is that a lot of medical imaging can potentially be done using very inexpensive instrumentation, or relatively inexpensive instrumentation. Because normally the routine breast imaging technique is magnetic resonance imaging, whole body MRI. And of course, MRI scanners are very large, they're very expensive, they're difficult to maintain. There's a lot of maintenance and quality control and quality assurance that needs to go into them. So running an MRI scanner is a really multi-million-dollar operation. They cost a few $1 million to buy, and then you have to have all that massive infrastructure built around them because, for example, you have to regularly refill them with liquid helium because you need to keep the coil at a superconducting temperature. You need to do a lot of quality assurance. You need to build a Faraday cage around the scanner. So they're very expensive machines.
Yeah.
And of course, most hospitals have at least 2 of them these days. But it's a major investment of money. And because any given hospital has only maybe 2 or 3 of those machines, the number of patients you can scan per day is naturally limited. Because if you say that a scan takes, say, 15 minutes if you include the turnaround time, that's 4 patients an hour, that's 96 patients in one day, provided that you keep running it round the clock.
Yeah.
Which is not always the option.
Yeah.
So yeah, what we show in this paper that you mentioned is that with breast imaging in particular, for assessment of mammographic density, you may not need these expensive high maintenance machines to get the information that you're after. You may actually be able to get it using much less expensive mobile portable instrumentation that requires minimal maintenance, minimal expenses, virtually no infrastructure. So you can actually take a lot of pressure off expensive state-of-the-art imaging instrumentation and use those low-cost machines instead. And then when you discover something that needs following up, then you can send the patient to the whole body machine and use that instrument time for tasks that really require it.
Yeah, well, that sounds amazing, honestly. So MRI machines use magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Do you mind explaining what that sort of involves?
Yeah, so if you think about water,
Yep.
So we know that the human body is roughly 70% water, give or take, and most tissues in your body contain roughly that amount of water, except bones. So cortical bone has very minimal amount of water, but all soft tissues have quite a lot of water. And of course, every water molecule is H2O. So you have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen.
Yeah.
And most of those hydrogens are the hydrogen 1 isotope. So hydrogen 1 isotope is the isotope of hydrogen that contains just a single proton in the nucleus. And that hydrogen nucleus has a very high magnetic moment. So by very high magnetic moment, I mean, of course, in nuclear terms. So it's a microscopically small amount of magnetization. But compared to other nuclei, it's actually quite a sizable magnetic moment. So you can think of a hydrogen nucleus as a microscopic bar magnet. So a single hydrogen nucleus would be too small to measure. So we don't really have the technology to measure the magnetic moment of a single hydrogen nucleus. But given that in the human body, you've got astronomically large numbers of water molecules, and therefore astronomically large numbers of hydrogen nuclei, you actually have the combined composite magnetic moment that is large enough to measure using macroscopic instrumentation. So you can literally put the patient into a coil, into an inductive coil, and excite those magnetic moments. And if the coil is in an applied static magnetic field, then those magnetic moments start precessing, very much like gyroscopes in a gravitational field.
Interesting.
And that means that you've got those precessing magnetic moments within an inductive coil, and according to Faraday's law, you induce electromotive force. And that's what you measure in MRI.
Interesting. So you're measuring like essentially water, like if you took a watermelon, for example, which is all water, it just looked white. It'd be like a white screen, and then you're seeing the soft tissue where the water concentration is essentially different across different.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit more sophisticated than that, because there's the concentration of water, which we call the spin density in MRI. Yeah. But there are also other parameters that determine the amplitude of the signal. And the other parameters are mainly the molecular mobility of water. So depending on how rapidly those water molecules tumble, they have different spin relaxation rate. So after you excite the magnetization, after you excite those magnetic moments, it takes some time for them to return back to equilibrium. And that time could be anywhere between milliseconds and seconds, depending on the physical environment that the water molecules live in.
Interesting. So currently we use 2D MRI machines, and from my understanding, we essentially take 2D images of like the soft tissue of like a shoulder, and we stack it up like 2D slices. How do we generate so these such highly detailed images? So magnetic spectroscopy, how does it get such a high detail? Is it essentially just because you're dealing with something so nanoscale and picking up?
Well, okay. So first of all, we do actually have already proper three-dimensional imaging techniques. So we can actually measure a three-dimensional map of the human body. So it doesn't necessarily have to be measured as a stack of two-dimensional layers. So we can actually run a three-dimensional image where you encode the three-dimensional information from the start. And there are multiple ways of doing it. There's so what we use in magnetic resonance is called pulse sequences. Yeah. So you have sequences of radio frequency pulses that you use to manipulate the magnetic moments. And you combine those radio frequency pulses with something we call magnetic field gradients, which provide spatial encoding. And in MRI, you have these very complex sequences where you combine radio frequency pulses with encoding gradients and decoding gradients in a certain very specific order. It's a little bit like playing a musical composition. So when you play a symphony, you've got this collection of instruments, and each instrument needs to play a certain note at a certain time, and that note has to be of a certain duration, played at a certain volume. And when you stitch it all together, you have this beautiful symphony resulting at the end. So MRI is a little bit like that. So you've got these pulse sequences which you execute, and you've got this very complex electronics that controls that execution process. And as a result, you not just get the signal from the magnetic moments that you're trying to measure, but you also get the spatial encoding. So you know which part of the human body, which location, which part of the signal comes from.
Awesome.
Essentially how you reconstruct those highly detailed three-dimensional images.
That's unreal. So you've also made quite outstanding, like significant contributions in molecular dynamics. And you do this through simulation. How do you go about simulating something so complex in nature?
Well, so simulate molecular dynamics is an interesting field of physics. So, of course, when we normally think about physics, we think about equations, and we solve those equations, we obtain analytic solutions. So, for example, if you wanted to send a rocket to the moon, you'd write down the equations of motion, you'd take into account all sorts of correction factors, all sorts of factors that are going to affect your trajectory, you solve those equations, and you calculate what your window of launch is, what launch parameters you need, and so on. So in normal mechanics, we can calculate the trajectory fairly far ahead with a high precision. So provided that the calculation methods are accurate enough, you can calculate the trajectory for potentially unlimited time. And that's how we know, for example, when the next solar eclipse or lunar eclipse is going to be, or when an asteroid is going to come visit us again.
Yeah.
Because we can actually do those calculations very, very accurately, very far ahead. Now, in molecular dynamics, we can't do that because the motion of molecules is inherently chaotic. And the reason it's chaotic is not because we cannot measure the positions of molecules accurately enough or the velocities of molecules, but rather there's an inherent chaoticity to the dynamics of many body systems in physics. So this is something that mathematicians have known since the early 20th century. And Poincaré, French mathematician Poincaré, was actually the first person to realize that when you have a system that includes some resonances, so for example, when you've got characteristic frequencies of motion, and you have two objects whose characteristic frequencies are matched, then the evolution of that system is inherently unpredictable. So it's inherently chaotic. So you may have two ensembles that are different by an infinitesimally small set of positions and velocities, but their trajectories will diverge very far, very quickly. So that's what happens with molecular motion. So you cannot really solve the equations. You have to simulate them numerically.
So for all the programmers out there, what sort of language do you use to go about that?
Well, the program that it's actually quite sophisticated software. So there are simulation packages that are already written that people use. So you don't actually have to write the molecular dynamics code from scratch normally. You can use existing simulation packages. And I think the actual packages have been written in C mostly. C is a compiled language. It's highly efficient. It's you can optimize it to death. You can parallelize it very easily.
Yeah.
So a lot of those standard molecular dynamics packages are written in C. I have actually written my own molecular dynamics code, which is quite a tedious task. I did need to do it at one stage because there was one very specific thing that I wanted to look at, which was not available in standard packages. And I actually wrote the first iteration in Mathematica. So it's a beautiful interactive programming language. It's a GUI, I guess. It's a user interface where you write code and you can execute it in real time. So it's great for debugging your code, because you write something, you run it, you see whether it works as it's supposed to. If not, then you find out where the bug is, you fix it on the spot, and then you write more code. The problem with Mathematica is that it's very slow. So then I started the process of translating it into other languages. We translated it to Python, then we translated it into Java. And I've actually got a student who's still collaborating with me. He's back in the UK now, but he's actually still working on that code, iterating the translation into faster languages. So it's it started as a small summer project, but it's evolved into an open-ended project almost.
It always does with programming, or for me at least.
Indeed.
It doesn't stop.
Well, I think you can say that about any science research project, really, is you start with something really small, really compact, and then you discover that you can do this, you can do that, and you can actually go in this direction, which is different from what you originally envisaged, and it snowballs from there.
So that's an interesting thought about, like, do you get much scope creep in your work? Like, where you go down, you're like, I want to research this hypothesis. And then you sort of allude out and you find new things you can research. Is it hard to sort of contain everything into, all right, I can't solve the world. I can't with this program. I got to slow down a little bit.
Well, I think what you described is the core time management problem that every science researcher faces, because by its very nature, every science research project is open-ended, because there's no finish line, so to speak. So you're not building a skyscraper. You're building a skyscraper that's open-ended.
Yeah.
So you can be building it forever. And of course, any researcher has a finite amount of time, so you have to prioritize. You have to sometimes you have to cut off promising directions of research, or you have to leave something till you have more time, or till you have someone else who can work on it.
Interesting.
So yeah, prioritization is definitely very important in science research.
Yeah. So you've also conducted research on molecular transport and diffusion. Could you explain a little bit what molecular transport is? Like, you don't throw a molecule on a train and it goes off.
Okay. Well, okay. If you think about a glass of water, so let's say got a glass of water on the table, and for the sake of simplicity, let's say that the glass of water is perfectly temperature equilibrated, so there's no convection, which of course is unachievable in practice. But in the first approximation, let's say that the glass is small enough, the viscosity is large enough, so the convection is virtually non-existent. So because there's no convection, there's no flow, there's no directional flow of water around the volume of the glass. But the water molecules are still moving, they're not static. And the reason they're moving is that every water molecule has 3 kT/2 worth of translational thermal energy. So every water molecule has a kinetic energy that's associated with its center of mass. So that means that at any given moment, every water molecule has a velocity, translational velocity. And basically what those water molecules are doing is they're kind of shoving past each other randomly. If you think about a densely packed crowd of people, and any given person doesn't particularly want to go anywhere, but they keep moving because they're moving, and they just shuffle past each other randomly. So that's essentially what water molecules are doing in that glass of water. And if you tag one water molecule, you'll find that as time goes on, that water molecule tends to move further and further away from its original position. So if you tag your water molecules in the glass, which you can actually do in a magnetic resonance measurement, you'll find that the root mean squared displacement of water molecules grows as the square root of time. So eventually all the molecules will be completely reshuffled around the volume of the glass if you leave them long enough.
Interesting. So I noticed that a considerable portion of your work is around MRI, like MRI technology. What led you to pursue this particular line of research, especially from a chemistry degree at start?
Well, two reasons. Well, first of all, I think magnetic resonance is a really fascinating field of research because it involves many different layers of physics. So it involves statistical physics, thermal physics, quantum mechanics, instrumentation, electronics, electromagnetism. So it's a technique that actually combines all fields of physics that you can think of. So it's quite fascinating from a purely technical point of view. The second reason is that you can actually find out a lot of really detailed information about the life of molecules using MRI. So, for example, let's say we think about the human body and the cells within the human body. So every given cell, in order to live, needs nutrients, and it also needs to get rid of the metabolic waste. And all those processes are random processes because nutrient molecules are inanimate, they're not intelligent, they don't know that they need to go to cell A and sustain that cell. And likewise, the molecules of metabolic waste are not intelligent, they don't know that they need to leave this molecule at a certain time once they're no longer needed. So all those processes are guided by very complex molecular machinery, but at the core of it, they're all random molecular processes because it's all just controlled by random motion of molecules. So the molecular machinery sets up directionality that, for example, makes waste molecules preferentially go out of the cell and nutrients preferentially go into the cell. But ultimately, the driver for all these processes is the random motion of molecules. So the same random diffusion of water molecules that you have in that hypothetical glass is also the process that you need in order to stay alive. Interesting. That's how we make sure that our cells function.
So, as you sort of just mentioned, MRI contains everything from theoretical work to it's got a direct clinical application, as you know, MRIs in hospitals. How do you as one person balance your time between doing your theoretical work and your experimental work, or even work where you know what you want to do and has a direct clinical application?
Well, okay, first of all, I don't do everything.
It looks like you do.
I work in a very small segment of MRI. So my research field is portable NMR, portable nuclear magnetic resonance. So that's the focus of what I do. So I don't directly deal with, hardcore clinical MRI, diagnostic MRI, brain MRI, and there are people who work with that. But as a research scientist, you cannot really work on everything at once. So you naturally have to limit yourself to one field or maybe several fields. So I focus on portable NMR. That's what I do. And there are other people who do, for example, neuroimaging, people who image nerve fiber tract pathways within the brain. There are people who focus on diagnostic MRI, things like diagnosing cancer or other diseases.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I'm not a diagnostic MRI clinician. I'm a research scientist. So my focus is on developing new approaches to the technique of magnetic resonance measurement.
Interesting. So that being said, in the modern era of science, everyone hears about, their favorite scientists from Einstein to Bohr. Is there any scientists in the modern era whose research you particularly admire, whether it's in your field or in a different field?
Well, yeah, there's quite a few. God, where do I start? I mean, there are so many really great scientists that I could only dream of becoming like. I mean, in the field of MRI, I guess one contemporary scientist who's still alive and who's still working very productively in science is Peter Basser, who's based at the National Institutes of Health in the US.
Yeah.
So he was the person who invented diffusion tensor imaging. So he first demonstrated diffusion tensor imaging in vitro on artificial samples. And then he demonstrated that you can apply that to the brain as well. So the whole neural tractography is essentially a result of his work, ultimately.
Amazing.
Of course, he's not the only person who's done work in that field, but he really created the foundation for neural tractography to be developed.
What about at QUT? Is there any of your colleagues whose research you've really just...
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of really exciting research being done at QUT, especially if you look at, for example, material sciences. Material sciences is really a big strength in QUT research. We've got a lot of people who are doing really exciting field things in that area, from development of new graphene materials to the development of solar panels and development of polymeric materials, for example. In biomedical engineering, you've got people who are developing materials for implants, materials for drug delivery, and there's really a lot of very exciting research coming out of QUT, definitely.
Interesting. So I personally did VRES, which is the vocational research scheme at QUT in my second year, and I was working with a few of the people in the physics and chemistry school, and we were doing lasers and optics, where it was essentially detecting materials at a distance using Raman spectroscopy. And I was, as a second year student, completely taken aback by my first glimpse of what QUT was actually doing, not just on a teaching standpoint. It was really quite amazing.
No, absolutely, because you have to remember that the reason that all the academics are in their teaching positions is that every one of them would have done a lot of research in their field. Every one of them is an internationally recognized expert in their field, so they know a lot of stuff about physics. And they know it not just from the books, but they know it firsthand from doing physics research.
So that being said, is there any opportunity for students to do their capstone project in physics or their PhD under your supervision?
Yeah, of course. I'm always on the lookout for bright students, definitely. Whether it's an experimental project in portable NMR, because that's an ongoing project, that's certainly open-ended research, or whether it's for example, molecular dynamic simulations or theoretical work on the development of NMI diffusion methodology, for example.
Yeah.
I'm totally open to taking on more bright PhD students.
Unreal. So we're sort of encroaching on a bit of time now, so I'll leave it with one more question. I noticed in emailing you back and forth over the last couple of days that your email signature for your QUT email features a quote at the end of it from the French mathematician Jacques Hadamard. And the quote is, "The shortest and best way between two truths of the real domain often passes through the imaginary one." Can you explain that for me?
Yeah.
All about it, in and out.
Okay. Well, of course, to a mathematician, that would immediately make sense, because if you're measuring a distance between 2 points, the shortest distance is not necessarily through the real valued points, but it may go through complex valued points.
Yeah.
So you have to go in the imaginary dimension, in that square root of -1 dimension, in order to find the shortest distance between 2 points in some complex space. But what I mean by it with regards to science is that science does not always work in a straightforward, linear, direct fashion. And in fact, having taken quantum mechanics this last semester, you can probably appreciate that these days, everywhere we turn, we've got quantum mechanics that underpins the technology that we use. You know, whether you use a mobile phone or a computer or a laser, or any well, even cameras, solid state devices in photographic cameras, it's all ultimately made possible by the development of quantum mechanics. But of course, that doesn't mean that sometime 100 years ago, physicists decided, oh, let's develop a computer. What do we need to develop a computer? We need to develop quantum mechanics, and then quantum mechanics will explain how atoms and molecules work. And from that, we can progress to understanding how solid state materials work. And we can build a transistor, and then out of transistors, we can make microchips and build a computer. So that wasn't how it worked at all, because of course, back in those days, people could not even conceptualize what a solid state computer might be. People would not have been able to conceptualize a transistor, because none of those things have even been possible back then. So people started looking at some really esoteric, abstract things, such as, for example, why is a hydrogen atom stable? How can a hydrogen atom exist? Why do we have no ultraviolet catastrophe? Why do electrons in metals require a certain wavelength threshold in order to kick them out of the metal when you irradiate them with light? So those were all very theoretical, very esoteric questions. They had no practical applications at the time, but they were all fundamentally important questions, because answering them allowed us to understand how the world works. And of course, once you understand how the world works, how atoms and molecules work, for example, you can start making stuff. So that's how we ultimately were able to start making semiconductors and transistors and microchips and everything else, and how we could start making those devices very, very efficient. So all of that ultimately is enabled by fundamental science, but of course the process from answering fundamental science questions to developing applications is not a linear process. There was no action plan to to develop a computer. It was a gradual and complex and highly convoluted evolution process that took scientists in all sorts of directions before they found that they could actually achieve some really exciting practical outcomes as a result.
It's really, I find it really surprising because you look at Moore's law, where the number of transistors doubles every 2 years. So your computational power essentially doubles every 2 years. And microchips are getting smaller and smaller. How, as you said, we don't actually necessarily know how we're going to do the next step, but we always somehow manage to do it. And now with
that's right. Well, that's one of the things that I mean by science being an open-ended process. Because once you find something out, you discover that beyond that, there's something else that is yet to be understood and found out. And then you start working on that. So, for example, with microchips, once you reach the molecular limit of Moore's law, once you discover that you can't pack transistors into microchips any denser because transistors become comparable to the size of an atom. Of course, the next step is to exploit quantum computing. You can start investigating, well, can quantum computing take us to the next step and increase the efficiency of computation many orders of magnitude again within the next 10, 20, 30 years.
We've got interesting times ahead of us. Very interesting.
Indeed.
So on that, I'm going to call it here. Thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to see students being genuinely interested in science and engineering and technology. So
I appreciate it.
Thank you for initiating this interview.
Thank you.